So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. Like Andrew, I'm always a little concerned when I'm placed in that post-lunch period when we're all sort of drifting towards that postprandial stupor. And especially to place the economist in that position is either the height of folly or an extraordinary vote of confidence I hope I can deliver on. So as Todd mentioned, I'm a professor here in the Graduate School of Education. I'm affiliated with our Center for Education Policy Analysis, which is on the top floor of the building we're in now. And my research interests are very broad, spanning K through 12, higher ed, and tentatively moving into early childhood as well. But the thread that kind of ties all of that together is an emphasis on using our best modern quantitative tools to try to ask and answer hard questions about what effects different design features appear to be having on key outcomes. So that can include what you might think of as big data, econometrically themed statistical designs, as well as designed experiments. So in the digital learning space, that's taking me a couple of different areas. So I'm working with colleague Eric Bettinger on studying a really mature, well-supported blended learning initiative that's focused on math and situated within the schools in kind of a middle-income country. I've also working with Eric Bettinger and a colleague, Dan McFarland. We're working closely with this really interesting company that manages a massive online professional network of teachers. It began with the Times Education Supplement in the UK, where something like 2/3 to 3/4 of teachers in the UK are registered, are members of this online network. They share resources, they communicate with each other through discussion fora, they connect with jobs through this. And this company has recently expanded its global reach dramatically. It's partnered with the AFT in the US, the major teachers union, and operates under the Share My Lesson metric. And really, it's kind of appearing at this kind of unique disruptive moment where we're asking teachers in the US to reinvent their practice around the Common Core. And they've gone through and tagged the literally millions of teacher-uploaded materials they have to try to facilitate those types of interactions. So we've been asking questions and answering them for them around things like, what kinds of things are teachers uploading? And what kinds of things are they downloading? And are there structural mismatches between them? And how do we think your first generation, frankly, somewhat crude version of crowdsourcing user feedback is working in terms of driving user engagement with the site? And in particular, my colleague, Dan McFarland, has been doing interesting work around kind of social network analysis of teacher interaction on that. So that's very exciting. I've also done recent work with a frequent collaborator of mine, Brian Jacob at Michigan, on a web-based plagiarism tutorial. So my fellow college instructors may appreciate this, that we have something of a tragedy of the commons problem, I think, when we're teaching college students writing, because most instructors like me don't think that teaching students how to write well and ethically is part of our writ. We think we're trying to convey content and engagement, but not necessarily writing skills. And often, all of that disappears from the formal and informal curriculum. And students pick up on that. They understand they're not being taught ethical writing. They understand that they're not necessarily being policed, and they understand conditional on being caught, the penalties are likely to be quite light. So a key part of a college curriculum, in some sense, is really being done poorly. So we were motivated to take some material available under a Creative Commons license and condition it so it can be embedded in Blackboard course management software. And then we ran a randomized trial of that, a cluster randomized trial, where a random half of a large set of college classrooms were assigned to a condition where students had to take it at the very beginning of the semester, where fighting plagiarism really starts, not at the end when they're rushing to complete a paper. And all of the students had to upload their courses or papers so we could analyze them for plagiarized content. And what we found was the intervention dramatically reduced plagiarism. And we were also interested in how. What were the mediators? Because the economists in us said, well, it might be that the intervention's not about human capital at all, but really just about deterrence. If I'm sitting in a classroom and all of a sudden there's a plagiarism tutorial, as a student I may be thinking, I better watch out and make sure I'm doing this ethically. What we found with follow-up surveys is that the treatment group actually understood plagiarism better, actually understood good strategies for avoiding it. And to me, that sort of underscored what I think of as some of the appeal of sort of digital mechanisms mediating teaching and learning, because it was really narrowly targeted to a very clearly delineated problem and situated in a way in which it could improve it. And then more recently, I've been moving heedlessly and shamelessly into the world of MOOCs, which is kind of an exciting one. And I guess before getting into some of the substance of that very early work, I wanted to underscore why I sort of find that appealing. Because I work in different policy domains that really have little or nothing to do with digital mechanisms. And it's partly that it just rings a couple of really compelling bells. One is this potentially heady promise of interventions that are low cost, which is a real concern among taxpayers and policymakers. Second, of course, the promise that we might be able to have really broad access. And another really critical issue is this idea of not just scaling, but scaling with high fidelity. I mean, I do a lot of work in social policy where we have designed experiments, and within the kind of hothouse environment of a carefully designed experiment, something might appear to work, but then when we try to take it to scale or replicate it elsewhere, we find whatever was the lightning in the bottle that made it work in one set of circumstances may not work in others. So ways in which we can have high fidelity of something of proven efficacy and targeted content is extraordinarily appealing. Now, the other part of this is just that it appeals to the social scientist in me as well. These digital environments are kind of this very pliable, tractable sandbox in which we can play around with different types of instructional design and just try to understand the sort of process of human capital development. And I should have mentioned the other thing that has kind of drawn me to this is the kind of the academic environment here at Stanford that I think has been promoted by John and my sort of leading colleagues in the GSE, like Mitchell and Roy and Candace, where it's a very porous environment where, again, heedless interlopers like me can sort of step in and get our feet wet in this exciting area. So that's been really gratifying. Okay, so today's focus is going to be on MOOCs and really the most basic fundamental form of student engagement, which is persistence. And I'm going to be talking about what are really two results from two separate early stage papers. One examines extant data from a large set of Coursera MOOCs and asks what traits that are specific to at the course level, the lecture level, and the student level appear to influence student persistence. And we're trying to make as much hay as we can out of the kinds of limited data that are available on these students, and you could talk about whether we can talk about whether that's interesting and where we might need to go. And the second thing is a field experiment we implemented that was kind of motivated by a lot of recent innovations in behavioral economics, where we field a nudge based on a kind of soft pre-commitment and ask whether it can promote achievement. Now, I want to stress right at the outset, as many of you know, there's been a lot of MOOC mania recently. First, kind of an almost hyperbolic optimism, and then within 10 minutes it seemed an equally hyperbolic backlash. And I guess my attitude is sort of a pox on both of their houses in some sense. The criticisms around persistence, and there's a big drop-off in persistence in MOOCs, as many of you know, you know, I want to stress, I think persistence is important at some level, right? Because it's about, I mean, I love the Woody Allen joke, 80% of success is showing up. I mean, just being there is a critical antecedent to actually learning things. But of course, I don't want to ignore or pretend that there aren't deeper forms of engagement and learning that are out there. And I also want to underscore the optimal level of persistence is not 100%. In some sense, if there's a huge drop-off in the early weeks of the course, that could be a kind of sensible search and self-inventory that we want our students to be undertaking. One of the things I often advise my undergraduates to do is aggressively shop courses and do it without shame. You can learn a lot about what's the right fit for you. So I think persistence matters, but I also don't want to overstate its construct validity as an outcome measure. Okay, and I also just want to intimate some things, second generation research that we have going on in the field. The first touches on what I think are some of the big questions around MOOCs. How do we think they might relate to key learner outcomes? And I think it's hard to generate convincing evidence on that. So what struck us as both a sort of compelling and low-hanging fruit has to relate to the ways in which MOOC completion might relate to labor market outcomes. So we've been collecting data on how MOOC completers represent their MOOC engagement in labor market scenarios, and we're poised to move ahead and think about what effects does their engagement have on key labor market outcomes. And we're also trying to get under the hood of some of the peer dynamics within MOOCs, which I think, I mean, we heard some great work this morning, you know, from Jeremy, Candace, and Andrew around blue sky reinvention of what MOOCs are doing. And what I hear from people is that the peer-to-peer interactions are really a critical part of that. So we're trying to study some of the interactions going on right now to see what we might be able to learn from that. Okay, but so the basic results from this early research. First, at the classroom level, what's the data set we have? Well, we were able to get data from 44 Coursera MOOCs that were offered over the 2012-11 period. Most of these courses were from Stanford. Most were in CS, math, statistics, and they had on average nearly 50,000 registrants per course. And we were able to code just a kitchen sink of different observed traits of these courses. Their size, did they have prerequisites? How many lectures did they have? What were the lengths of the lectures they had? Had this course been offered previously, et cetera? And we played around with different outcome measures, but in the current presentation, we're trying to focus on 3 that get at different levels of persistence. First, the percent who just didn't drop off fairly quickly. What percent of registrants watched 20% or more of lectures? And we see that that's still quite low. It's around 38%. What percent of registrants persist all the way to earning a certificate? And I should note 4 of these courses are excluded from this because they didn't offer certificates. That's only about 5%. And you can see from the standard deviations, there's variance around this to explore. And then we also want to get at the question of, among those who've gotten past that initial fall off, in some sense have demonstrated a level of persistence, what's the chance that they get a certificate? What's the probability of completing a certificate conditional on having watched 20% of the lectures? And we see that's about 22%. So for this first course level analysis, we just ran basic cross-sectional regressions where we regress these outcomes on this kitchen sink set of course level traits. And I just wanted to highlight a few findings. One is that the second or higher offerings of a course have substantially lower levels of persistence. So 10 percentage points less likely to watch 20% of more videos, for example, in a second offering, suggesting that the initial offering of a given course were the ones that really drew out of the woodwork the matriculants who appeared to have the highest motivation. But another thing we observed, remember, these courses were being rolled out over this 12-13 sample window. We observed that the ones that were offered later had higher persistence. So for example, a course offered 10 weeks later the students were 1 percentage point more likely to get a certificate, which may seem small, but remember the base probability is quite low. So that's something like a 20% increase in the mean probability. And so we're not entirely sure what that means. It could, to some degree, being a growing public awareness of MOOCs during this window, attracted better fit, higher motivated students. It could be that there was a growing legitimacy to MOOCs over this narrow sample window that also encouraged persistence. Now, another thing we observed has to do with courses with prerequisites. They tend to have significantly lower persistence on the intensive margin. Among those who've lasted through that initial fall off, they've watched 20% of the lectures. We see if in those courses, if there are prerequisites, they're nearly 8 percentage points less likely to get a certificate. Again, a big effect off the kind of low prevalence means we're seeing. And then there were also some interesting null findings, some things where things we thought might have had an effect didn't appear to. It's sort of, it's the literary metaphor, it's the dog that didn't bark, right? The number of students per course we thought might perhaps create more lively discussion fora that might promote existence. The number of lectures per course might have inhibited persistence, or the average length of lectures across course. And we find that those things appear to have small and statistically significant effects at the course level on all our measures of persistence. And when I talk about what this might mean for next generation research, I'm going to harken back to all this. But let me drill down now to the lecture level. So we had these 44 MOOCs with over 2 million students. Within those 44 MOOCs, there were roughly 2,400 unique lectures. And so we identified what were the features of these lectures and how did it appear to influence the percent of registrants who actually watched them. And for the full sample, the mean there was a little below 16%. And the general pattern, not surprisingly, if you've engaged with MOOCs at all, is there's high initial engagement that tends to fall off rapidly and then trail off at a more modest rate. So here's a visual example of that for courses like Computer Science 101, the second offering of game theory, machine learning, probability graphical models, and the vertical axis is the number of unique views And the darkened cells refer to the first offering within a new batch or week of MOOCs. And one of the results we're going to highlight here is, yes, they're declining linearly, but they also decline within week. The first lecture offered within a week is uniquely viewed. So that's worth mentioning. Okay, so how more formally did we get at understanding what effects lecture traits are having on persistence among students? So we have implemented an econometrically themed analysis.
You mean like a video clip of some
A unique,
TED presentation.
exactly. And there are 2,400 unique ones of them in this data set. So for those of you who like equations and statistics, here's a sort of generalized version of the model we introduced. I sort of joke with people, I think it's in my professor contract that if you come to Stanford, I have to show you an equation with some Greek letters before you leave, just so you could say that that happened. But what's going on here is we're looking at outcomes for lecture I in course G in week T, and saying, let's control for everything that's unique about the course. Literally put in dummy variables unique to each one of the 44 courses. And a dummy variables, fixed effects for everything that's unique to a moment in time. And then say conditional on that, how do lecture traits appear to influence persistence? So that's the key thought experiment. Once we net out the fact that this course has different persistence than that course, and this week has different persistence than that week, that residual variation, and there's a lot of it, how does that relate to the specific traits of the lecture? So that's the thought experiment we're trying to implement here. So I just wanted to highlight with my brief time a few findings. First, the first lecture of the week is 2.1 percentage points off a 16% mean, remember, more likely to be viewed than other lectures. And interestingly, as with the course level data, we're seeing the length of the video has small statistically significant effects on watching. And I want to make a caveat about out of sample predictions here. It doesn't mean you could dial up lecture length so it's like some kind of Wagnerian 12-hour opera and expect people to persist in it, right? But within the sample variation, lecture length doesn't appear to matter. And the other thing that really struck us as interesting is we spent time coding up the types of titles the lectures had, and that had quite a bit of purchase on persistence in the course. Interestingly, lectures that were titled with things like introduction, overview, welcome, were in the range of 2 to 12 percentage points, again, off a 16% mean, more likely to be watched. And interestingly, somewhat surprisingly to me, lectures that had review in the title, conclusion, exercise optional advance are less surprising, but all of these were less likely to be watched. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what does this mean in a moment, just so you know I'm not going to leave that on the table. But first let me briefly mention drilling down yet further in this nested data structure to the student level. Remember, we've got 2.1 million unique course student registrants across these MOOCs. And the key outcome measures I wanted to discuss are simply 0, 1, did they get a certificate? Again, the mean's around 5%, and the number of lectures they watched on average. And in that full sample, that's about 10. And for one of the science MOOCs, we have more detailed information from a baseline survey that was introduced. And again, the basic kind of big data econometric specification has this form where we're leveraging the nested nature of the data to try to generate rigorous inferences, controlling for what's unique about this course. And again, the thought experiment, we're essentially comparing how student traits among those in the same course appears to influence persistence. So just a few findings. Interestingly, those who register long before a course starts, they registered 5 or more weeks before the course actually began, are over 1 percentage point less likely to get a certificate. And that's something that motivated the experiment I'm going to describe. And those who register after a course started are less likely to get a certificate and watch fewer lectures, 1 to 5 fewer lectures. So that implies numerically, given the number of videos most MOOCs offer, that there's some catch-up, but it's a partial catch-up for people who are coming online late. And interestingly, the survey data suggests there's uniquely high persistence among those who are motivated by an affiliation with a prestigious university. They watch more lectures. Okay, so what might this mean? Well, I just want to suggest that this kind of exploratory, econometrically themed effort might suggest next stage experiments, A-B contrasts that might be propitious for thinking about design features in MOOCs. So for example, just to brainstorm a few ideas, the fact that there's lower long-term persistence among students who've demonstrated some engagement in those courses with prerequisites suggests that if you think it's pedagogically appropriate to keep underprepared students in those courses, you might want to consider offering tracks that are tailored to their desired level of engagement. And the other thing I want to point out, the primacy of a week's first lecture and the seeming irrelevance of lecture length suggests instructors might want to consider having longer and fewer lectures, okay? And so the metaphor I have in mind, maybe it's because we just had the Belmont Stakes, is how they give medicine to horses. You know, they put a pill inside of an apple. If you want to get more content to your students and maybe embed critical exercises, offering fewer lectures that are 20 minutes instead of 10 minutes and getting those exercises they're not going to click on inside those first 20 minutes may be a way to convey that information. And again, lecture titles, those suggesting brevity and synopsis appear to really drive uptake. So again, embedding the exercises is important. And interestingly, the fact that those who register early are more likely to drop off, I thought was really provocative from a behavioral economics perspective. And you can imagine A-B contrast where you tell early registrants, you're not registered yet, give us your email, we'll come back to you a week before it's due and then prompt you to register. That might drive persistence. And what I think is going on here, and I'm only going to have a few minutes to describe this, is this phenomenon in economics we call time inconsistency that's come out of behavioral economics. And the basic idea is that there's this hypothesis that people exhibit time inconsistent preferences, by which we mean in period T, you might think I should do a certain behavior in period T+1. But when T+1 arrives, you decide not to do it. Okay? So one of the canonical examples is exercising. You might say, I should exercise next month, so I'm going to buy a gym membership, and you do, and then when you show up, when the next month arrives, you just don't go. Okay? Yes. Okay. Well, we're not hanging out then, if that's how it's going to be. So the implication of this is that people are going to seek out and value pre-commitment mechanisms, right? Like buying healthy food at the supermarket so they won't snack on terrible food tomorrow when they know they're going to have self-control problems. So there's a growing empirical literature on this in economics that's where people have tried to offer field, carefully designed pre-commitment mechanisms to see if they could leverage things like employer effort in the workplace, savings, healthy behaviors. And our team thought, let's try this in the MOOC setting. Why? Because people have demonstrated some intentionality around gaining this human capital by taking the time to register, but they're falling off at a considerably higher rate. And in particular, those who registered early, which is suggestive of this time inconsistency phenomenon. Let's give them a nudge, a pre-commitment opportunity, and see whether it influences achievement. So since I'm running out of time, I'll just describe that in a nutshell. Essentially, we fielded what in this literature would be called a soft pre-commitment device. We took a kind of fairly generic science MOOC and randomly assigned half the students to receive an email from the instructor that said, scheduling your time to watch the lectures is important for your success in this course, and it linked them to a Qualtrics survey where they could identify the day and time at which they would watch the lecture. And the control group got a kind of inert email with a Qualtrics survey about browser choice. And so the idea is that people would fix a time in their mind, and it would be kind of psychologically costly to deviate from that and from the instructor's recommendation that they might persist. In fact, we found they did not. First of all, the uptake of the pre-commitment mechanism was fairly low. It was only on the order of about 10%, which still gives us great statistical power. And it had null effects on persistence, however defined. And interestingly, we found that it actually had significantly negative effects on completion of the course. And the survey data allowed us to see that was actually concentrated among a very particular subgroup of people who had shallow motivation for taking the MOOC. They were the ones who said, I'm just curious about the online environment. And when they got hit with an email that said, look, schedule your time if you really want to do well in this course, our hypothesis is it signaled a kind of seriousness of purpose that really drove them away. So some humility around fielding these sort of things, and I think a kind of cautionary tale that it's important to evaluate the innovations you have in mind really rigorously. And I guess I'll conclude with that sort of note that in some sense, the organizations that really excite me are the ones that are willing to proceed with agnosticism and humility and a willingness to build up and tear down. things that they design and evaluate and that may or may not work. So thank you for your time. Sorry to run over.